The torches burned long into the Roman night. From the marble terraces of the Palatine Hill, the laughter of courtiers echoed into the darkness, mingling with the faint cries of the city below. At the center of it all sat a man who was barely more than a boy when he took the throne, yet he would go down in history as one of Rome's most notorious rulers. His name was Nero, and under his reign, sex, power, and spectacle became indistinguishable. What unfolded in his court was so shocking, so depraved, that even the Romans, who were no strangers to indulgence, whispered about it in horror. Imagine stepping into Nero's palace at night. The corridors are draped with silks imported from the east, the air thick with incense and the faint metallic temps of spilled wine. Courtiers recline in lavish banqueting halls where the floors are sprinkled with rose petals, not in handfuls, but in mountains, so suffocating that ancient sources claimed guests sometimes choked to death beneath the weight of blossoms. Behind closed doors, slaves and noble women alike are summoned into rituals of lust and humiliation. And presiding over it all is Nero himself, an emperor who saw no boundary between art, sex, and cruelty. The Romans believed the gods themselves demanded spectacle. Gladiators bled for their entertainment. Exotic beasts were slaughtered for applause. But Nero's stage was not the Colosseum, it was his bedroom, his banquet hall, his palace. Here, power was not only displayed through armies or politics, but through the most intimate, forbidden acts of the flesh. To resist was dangerous. To displease was fatal. In the twisted theater of Nero's court, sex became a weapon, and shame became a form of domination. Why do we begin here? Because Nero's scandals were not isolated debaucheries, they were symptoms of something much darker, the collision of absolute power with unchecked desire. The Roman elite could tolerate cruelty, they could tolerate extravagance, but when their emperor blurred the lines between sacred and profane, public and private, even the decadent capital of the world trembled. Our story tonight will plunge into those forbidden chambers. We will uncover Nero's marriages, one to a boy castrated and dressed as a woman, another to a noblewoman forced into a grotesque parody of Roman virtue. We will witness his twisted entertainments, public orgies disguised as festivals, humiliation designed to break rivals, and cruel performances where sex and death shared the same stage. And we will explore the psychology behind it all, how a young ruler, raised in paranoia and surrounded by sycophants, turned sexuality into the ultimate theater of power. But before we reveal the most scandalous details, let us place ourselves in the Rome of the first century. This was a city of contradictions. Temples to Jupiter towering above alleys filled with prostitutes, laws demanding marital fidelity while emperors paraded their mistresses, citizens who condemned depravity even as they flocked to it in secret. Nero did not invent Rome's obsessions, he magnified them, twisting desire into dominance until the empire itself seemed enslaved. For the next half hour, you will step into that world. You will walk the torchlit corridors of Nero's palace. You will hear the whispers of his courtiers, the gasps of his victims, and the rumors that turned the eternal city into a stage of fear. And you will confront a question that still haunts history. When sex becomes a tool of tyranny, what happens to those caught in its grip? This is not the Rome of marble monuments and noble Caesars. This is Rome at its most forbidden, where emperor's lust could topple families, ignite scandals, and push an empire to the brink of collapse. Welcome to the twisted court of Nero. Power in ancient Rome was never just about armies or decrees, it was about performance, image, and control. The Senate could pass laws, but the emperor commanded bodies, desires, and reputations. Nero understood this instinctively. To him, intimacy was not privated, was political currency, a stage upon which submission and dominance were rehearsed. In his world, sex was not about pleasure alone. It was about control. Roman society was already steeped in hierarchy. Husbands owned the bodies of their wives. Masters commanded the flesh of their slaves, and powerful men used their sexual access as proof of status. But Nero elevated this system into a weapon of statecraft. He demanded not simply loyalty, but humiliation. To share his bed was not a privilege, it was a test of obedience. Courtiers, senators, and noblewomen quickly realized that their survival in Rome's most dangerous court depended as much on how they yielded in Nero's chambers as how they maneuvered in the Senate. Take, for instance, the infamous relationship Nero had with Sporus, a young boy whose life would become one of history's most disturbing parables of power. Ancient sources tell us that Nero was so enamored with the boy that he ordered him castrated and forced him into the role of an empress. Dressed in fine silks, veiled like a bride, Sporus was paraded before the people as Nero's wife. Ceremonies were staged to mimic a legitimate Roman marriage, complete with dowries and wedding banquets. What was this, if not the ultimate humiliation? For Sporus, his very body was reshaped to satisfy the emperor's obsession. For the court, it was a chilling reminder that Nero could redefine reality itself, turning a boy into a queen, turning mockery into ritual. This was not love as we understand it. This was the naked display of control. The castration, the public ceremony, the forced masquerade, it was all theater, carefully staged to reinforce one message: Nero's will was law, even over the sanctity of the human body. But Nero's twisted relationships did not end with Sporus. He also married Poppaea Sabina, a woman renowned for her beauty and ambition. Their union was no fairy tale. Ancient accounts describe her as manipulative and calculating, yet even she could not escape the dangers of Nero's violent passions. In a fit of rage, Nero reportedly kicked Poppaea to death while she was pregnant with his child. Even his legitimate relationships bore the stain of cruelty, reminding all of Rome that no one, not wife, not mistress, not unborn heir, was safe from his desires. Through these relationships, Nero blurred the lines between intimacy and tyranny. To him, a bed was as much a battlefield as any Roman frontier. Desire became a form of conquest, and the body became both trophy and hostage. And yet, we must understand the psychology behind these actions. Nero was raised in a nest of paranoia. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a ruthless manipulator who had seduced her way into the corridors of power. Whispers of incest followed them both, hinting that young Nero had learned early on that sexuality and dominance were intertwined. By the time he became emperor, his understanding of intimacy was already distorted, less about affection, more about manipulation, more about control. In the culture of Rome, where masculinity was defined by domination and femininity by submission, Nero weaponized both roles. He played the aggressor, forcing submission upon men and women alike. But he also reveled in shocking reversals, appearing in public dressed as a woman, or taking the passive role in staged sexual encounters, deliberately inverting Roman norms of power. To his court, these acts were terrifying, not because they were immoral, but because they showed that Nero had no boundaries. He could bend social rules the way he bent people. What made it more sinister was the performative nature of it all. Nero often staged orgiastic banquets where senators and noblewomen were compelled to participate. Slaves served not only food and wine, but their own bodies. Guests who hesitated were mocked or punished. These events were spectacles designed not for pleasure but for domination. It was a reminder to Rome's elite that their emperor could strip them of dignity, make them actors in his grotesque theater, and that resistance was not an option. And this is where the true horror lies, not in the individual acts of lust or cruelty, but in the way desire itself became a language of power. Every relationship, every scandal, every humiliation was a message carved into the flesh of Rome. You belong to me. For Nero, desire was not private, it was imperial. It was a weapon that crushed rivals, silenced dissenters. For the people of Rome, the scandal was twofold. First, the castration of Sporus was an affront to Roman ideals of masculinity. To mutilate a freeborn youth for the sake of pleasure was unthinkable, even in a society where slavery and exploitation were commonplace. Second, the marriage mocked the very institutions of Roman power. The empress's role was sacred. She embodied fertility, continuity, and the moral integrity of the empire. To replace her with a castrated boy was not just indecency, it was blasphemy. But this was only the beginning. Nero's appetite for scandal thrived on escalation. He hosted festivals in the palace gardens that ancient writers describe as nightmarish carnivals of lust. Torches lit up the night as men and women of the elite were compelled to shed their dignity. Senators, wives, and daughters were brought in, sometimes willingly, more often than not, and paired off with strangers or, worse, with the emperor himself. Nero would appear on stage, dressed in animal skins, attacking men and women bound to stakes, acting out scenes of rape and domination in front of the crowd. These were not private indulgences. They were public performances. To be invited was not an honor but a sentence. Refusal was dangerous. Compliance was degrading. Participation marked Rome's most powerful citizens with a stain that could never be washed away. And that was the point. By dragging Rome's elite into his sexual theater, Nero ensured their silence. How could a senator condemn the emperor when his own wife had been made a spectacle before hundreds of eyes? How could a noblewoman speak against him when she herself had been paraded in shame? Every scandal bound the court more tightly to Nero, each humiliation weaving a net of complicity that ensured no one could stand against him, and yet, the human cost was devastating. Sporus, once a boy with a future, was now a living symbol of Nero's cruelty. Ancient accounts describe him as a pale shadow of himself, veiled and silent, forever caught in the emperor's sick drama. Paranoia, Nero's true wife, fared no better. Her death at his hands, whether accidental or deliberate, was the ultimate reminder that love, in Nero's world, was indistinguishable from violence. Perhaps the most chilling detail of all is how the people responded. For some, Nero's excesses were entertaining gossip whispered in taverns and streets. For others, they were a sign that Rome's moral core had rotted. The Stoic philosopher Seneca, once Nero's tutor, despaired at what his pupil had become. He tried to rein in the emperor's passions, urging restraint, reminding him of virtue. But in the end, Seneca himself was forced into suicide, his own veins opened as punishment for a supposed conspiracy. His death symbolized the futility of opposing a ruler who wielded desire like a dagger. The aftermath of these scandals was corrosive. Rome's respect for the imperial office eroded. The army, once loyal, began to grumble. The Senate plotted in whispers. Even the common people, once entertained by Nero's spectacles, began to mutter that their emperor cared more for his private debaucheries than the welfare of the empire. And yet, Nero pressed forward. His court became a theater of inversion, where men were women, women were slaves, slaves became actors, and shame became currency. The emperor believed himself untouchable, immune to the very norms that bound his people. He saw himself as an artist, a god of lust and spectacle. But the more he indulged, the more fragile his throne became. This scandal, this marriage to a boy, this carnival of forced pleasure and humiliation was not just shocking, it was a warning sign. It revealed the depth of corruption, the loss of restraint, the utter collapse of boundaries that had once defined Roman society. And though Nero could silence dissenters in his court, he could not silence the growing discontent beyond the palace walls. The stage was set. Rome had tolerated extravagance before. It had tolerated cruelty, decadence, and lust. But what Nero had unleashed was something different, a new form of tyranny, one rooted not in swords or laws, but in the violation of the most intimate human boundaries. And as we shall see, this grotesque theater of sex and power was about to spill beyond the palace gates, reshaping politics itself. Because when desire becomes the currency of empire, betrayal is never far behind. Rome's corridors of power had always been arenas of seduction. Behind the Senate's marble walls and the empire's public pageantry, politics was a game of whispers, marriages, and bedsheets. But under Nero, the stakes grew darker. Intimacy became blackmail. Desire became a trap. And the court of the emperor was less a government than a web of lust and betrayal, spun by a ruler who reveled in humiliation. At the heart of this political theater stood Nero's mother, Agrippina, the younger woman, as ambitious as any Caesar. From the moment Nero inherited the throne at just 17, Agrippina tried to hold the reins. Ancient whispers even suggested an incestuous bond. Rumors fanned by her constant presence in his chambers, her dominance in palace affairs, and her use of sexuality as influence. Whether true or not, the suggestion itself tarnished Nero's legitimacy. To Roman eyes, a man enslaved to his mother's will was no man at all. Nero grew to resent her power. In a chilling echo of his approach to intimacy, he decided that if he could not control her, he would destroy her. The plot to kill Agrippina reads like a macabre play. First came the attempt to poison her, then the collapsing ceiling designed to crush her as she slept, and finally, the infamous collapsible boat that would sink at sea. When these schemes failed, Nero sent soldiers to finish the job, cutting down the very woman who had birthed him into power. The murder of Agrippina was not just a family drama, it was the first great sign that Nero's lust for domination could not be confined to the bedroom. Her death unchained him. With Agrippina gone, there was no one left in Rome who could restrain his indulgences. He filled his palace with actors, prostitutes, and flatterers, pushing aside senators and generals in favor of men and women who catered to his cravings. Every banquet became a stage for seduction, every festival an excuse for humiliation. Those who resisted were quietly exiled or forced to drink poison. The politics of Rome soon turned into a grotesque masquerade. Wives of senators were summoned into Nero's chambers, sometimes willingly, more often trembling with dread. Husbands could do nothing but watch, forced to swallow their humiliation. To refuse the emperor's advances meant treason. To comply meant disgrace. Either way, Nero had them in his grip. The most powerful men in Rome were reduced to silent spectators while their wives and daughters were paraded as trophies. But seduction was only one side of Nero's weapon. The other was shame. Ancient sources describe how he staged games in which noblemen and women were compelled to perform sexual acts in public, disguised as plays or Bacchic rituals. Those who participated could never speak against him afterward. They were forever compromised, their reputations stained. With every scandal, Nero tied Rome's elite more tightly to his own corruption, ensuring that betrayal would mean exposure of their own darkest secrets. Yet betrayal still came. The most famous conspiracy against Nero, the so-called Pisonian conspiracy of 65 CE, was born not simply of politics, but of resentment festering in the shadows of his court. Senators humiliated by his sexual mockeries, generals stripped of honor, and even poets weary of his theatrics gathered in secret to plot his assassination. For a brief moment, it seemed the web might collapse, but Nero's spies uncovered the plot, and his vengeance was swift. Senators were forced to slit their wrists, their blood-soaking marble floors. Poets like Lucan, accused of treason, were executed, their verses silenced forever. Most haunting was the fate of Seneca, Nero's old tutor, compelled to open his veins in one of Rome's most infamous forced suicides. Even in death, Seneca's calm composure contrasted with Nero's chaos, as though philosophy itself were rebuking tyranny. And yet, even this bloodbath could not erase the truth. The conspiracy had been fueled as much by humiliation as by politics. Nero's use of sexuality as domination had created not loyalty, but loathing. His court may have been silenced for the moment, but the cracks in his regime widened with every scandal. Religion, too, became entangled in his lust. The Romans believed. The gods demanded purity and ritual, and soon, the same passions that Nero used to tighten his grip on Rome would ignite the flames of rebellion. For when desire rules politics, it is only a matter of time before politics devours desire. While Nero's court was a theater of perversion and power, outside the palace gates, ordinary Romans watched with a mixture of fascination, disgust, and resignation. Scandal was nothing new to the empire. Emperors had long kept mistresses, consorts, and harems of slaves. But Nero's excesses, flaunted so publicly, blurred the fragile line between what was whispered in private and what was tolerated in the open. To understand why these practices struck Rome so deeply, we must step into the lives of the people who lived beneath his rule. For the common Roman sexuality was woven into the fabric of daily existence. Marriage was rarely about love, was a contract of property and lineage, binding families through dowries and alliances. Fidelity was expected of wives, but husbands roamed freely. A man might visit prostitutes, take concubines, or sleep with slaves without social consequence, so long as he maintained his role as patriarch. For women, the rules were brutally different. An unfaithful wife could be divorced in disgrace, disinherited, even executed if her infidelity threatened the honor of her husband. This double standard was accepted as natural, reinforced by law and tradition. Slavery complicated everything further. Slaves had no rights over their bodies. They existed as property, tools of labor and pleasure. In wealthy households, it was understood that masters and mistresses would take sexual liberties with slaves. Young boys and girls were particularly vulnerable, their bodies seen as commodities to be used at will. This normalized culture of exploitation meant that many Romans, while shocked at Nero's excesses, were not surprised by the mechanisms he used, only by the scale and audacity with which he flaunted them. The festivals and staged orgies Nero hosted exposed this divide with brutal clarity. To the elite, these spectacles were humiliations, but to the masses, they were a grotesque inversion of familiar customs. Citizens gathered in taverns to whisper about senators' wives forced to perform before crowds, about noblemen made to grovel while their bodies were mocked. Ordinary Romans, already accustomed to the exploitation of slaves and prostitutes, saw with schadenfreude the great families brought low. If anything, Nero's orgies revealed the hypocrisy of Rome's moral pretenses. The same society that condemned adultery and praised virtue was willing to look away from daily abuses until those abuses touched the nobility. The cultural double standard stretched into questions of gender and identity. Roman masculinity was defined by domination, both in politics and in the bedroom. To penetrate was to assert control. To be penetrated was to submit, a role reserved for slaves, women, or defeated enemies. Nero's scandalous choices: the passive role in encounters, marrying Sporus as his bride, dressing in women's clothing, were not shocking merely because they broke sexual taboos. They inverted Rome's very hierarchy of gender and power. If the emperor himself could embody submission, what did that say about the order of the world? And yet, Rome was not a monolith. In the crowded tenements of the Subura, in smoky taverns and brothels, the common people were far less concerned with virtue than with survival. Prostitution flourished openly, regulated by the state, taxed like any other trade. Brothels lined the streets, while graffiti scrawled on walls testified to the bawdy humor of the masses. For these citizens, Nero's debauchery was entertainment, a source of gossip, and perhaps even envy. The emperor's excesses mirrored, in exaggerated form, the realities of a society where sex was already commodified. Religion, too, played a role in shaping reactions. Traditional Roman cults emphasized fertility, family, and piety, but mystery religions imported from the East brought rituals of ecstasy and divine union. Some of Nero's theatrics' mock marriages, his public orgies echoed the rites of Bacchus, where worshippers sought transcendence through intoxication and frenzy. To conservative Romans, these echoes were blasphemous distortions. To others, they were familiar, even thrilling. The divide between outrage and fascination was as much cultural as it was moral. The daily lives of women were particularly shaped by this atmosphere. Elite women were trapped between expectations of virtue and the emperor's whims. Some wielded their sexuality strategically, becoming mistresses or courtiers to gain influence. Others were destroyed by it, reduced to pawns in Nero's humiliating games. Meanwhile, common women navigated a world where survival often meant selling their bodies, either in brothels or as unofficial concubines. In both cases, their lives reflected the larger truth. In Rome, sexuality was power, but almost never their own. For ordinary Romans, Nero's scandals revealed both the fragility and the hypocrisy of their society. They were disgusted by his audacity, but complicit in the same structures that enabled it. They condemned his mockeries of marriage, yet accepted marriages as contracts of convenience. They whispered about his orgies, yet filled brothels daily. They mocked his perversions, yet laughed at obscene graffiti and purchased phallic charms for good luck. In this sense, Nero's court was less an aberration than a mirror. His grotesque theater of desire reflected the underlying truths of Roman life, truths many preferred to keep hidden. And that was what made it so dangerous. By dragging what was whispered in private into the glare of public spectacle, Nero forced Rome to confront itself. But Rome's tolerance had limits. Even in a society accustomed to cruelty and hypocrisy, there comes a moment when excess tips into outrage. Nero was about to cross that line, because the scandals of his court were not just humiliations, they were sparks thrown into the dry timber of an empire already smoldering with unrest. And when those sparks caught flame, even the mighty emperor would find himself consumed. Every empire tolerates excess until the excess consumes the empire itself. For years, Nero's twisted court had survived through fear, humiliation, and spectacle. Senators bowed, generals obeyed, and commoners whispered but endured. But there came a moment when even decadent Rome could stomach no more. That turning point was not just one scandal, it was a storm of fire, betrayal, and rebellion that revealed the emperor's grotesque appetites had pushed the empire to the edge. The most infamous spark came in 64 CE, the Great Fire of Rome. For 9 days, flames devoured the city, consuming temples, markets, and homes. Entire districts collapsed into ash, leaving thousands homeless and starving. Ancient sources debate whether Nero started the fire himself. Some claim he ordered it to clear land for his palatial golden house. Others that he merely seized the opportunity afterward. But what matters most is not the truth, it is what the people believed. Rumors spread that the emperor had stood upon his balcony, dressed in theatrical costume, singing of Troy's destruction as the city burned. Whether fact or slander, the image was unforgettable. Nero, the artist's emperor, playing his lyre while his subjects screamed in the streets. For Romans, this was not merely negligence, it was blasphemy. Their emperor had turned catastrophe into performance. To divert blame, Nero sought scapegoats. He turned his fury upon a small, mysterious sect of Christians. In grotesque spectacles, he had them crucified, torn apart by dogs, or burned alive as human torches to light his gardens. To some, these punishments reaffirmed imperial power, but to many others, they revealed Nero's sadistic cruelty. Once again, sex and death mingled in his theater. For some of these executions were staged as obscene parodies of religious rites. Rome watched in horror as persecution became entertainment. But the fire did more than tarnish Nero's image. It revealed the gulf between ruler and ruled. While citizens wandered homeless, Nero built his domus, Oreatha, golden house and opulent. Palace glittering with marble, jewels, and fountains. Its halls were lined with erotic frescoes, its dining rooms designed so that ceilings could rain down rose petals on feasting guests. To the people, this was an insult beyond endurance. Their homes had burned, their families had died. For Nero himself, the turning point was deeply personal. His bride Sporus, once paraded as empress, had become a living reminder of the emperor's cruelty. Court whispers mocked Nero behind closed doors, senators exchanged knowing glances, and even the common people laughed bitterly at the sight of Rome's ruler walking hand in hand with a castrated youth in bridal attire. What had once been intimidation had curdled into ridicule, and ridicule, in politics, is more dangerous than fear. The final blow came when rebellion erupted among the legions. The empire's soldiers, who had endured Nero's neglect while watching, resources poured into festivals, races, and orgies, rose in defiance. The Senate, sensing opportunity, turned against him. Abandoned by allies, scorned by the people, and hunted by his own guards, Nero found himself utterly alone. In June of 68 CE, The once mighty emperor fled the city he had ruled with lust and terror. Hiding in a villa outside Rome, he begged his companions to kill him, unable to face capture. When none would act, Nero drove a dagger into his own throat, muttering the chilling words, "Qualis, artifex, perio, what an artist dies in me." Even in his final breath, he saw himself not as tyrant, not as ruler, but as performer. His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, plunging Rome into civil war. The turning point of Nero's reign was not simply the fire or the rebellions. It was the moment Rome decided it would no longer be humiliated. The emperor had crossed every boundary. He had mocked marriage, desecrated tradition, turned death into theater, and wielded desire as tyranny. But in the end, what destroyed him was not lust alone, was the way his lust exposed the fragility of power itself. Rome could endure cruelty. It could endure indulgence. But it could not endure a ruler who turned the empire into his bedroom stage, who reduced senators, generals, and citizens to unwilling actors in his grotesque play. Nero's death was not merely the fall of a man. It was the inevitable collapse of a world where power and perversion had become indistinguishable. Nero's reign left scars deeper than scandal. His grotesque theater of lust eroded faith in the imperial office, proving that unchecked desire could destabilize an empire as surely as war. The Senate, humiliated and complicit, reasserted its role after his fall, while future emperors used morality as propaganda, defining themselves against his excess. Christianity, once scapegoated by Nero, grew stronger, its martyrs inspiring defiance against imperial corruption. Archaeological remains of his Domus Aurea still gleam, silent, testimony to a ruler who confused power with performance. In the centuries that followed, Nero